Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily or have been interacting in several different conflicts. And in some cases, they're on the same side, and in some cases, they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
2 years ago this month, in August 2021, Taliban forces entered Kabul, Afghanistan, toppling the U.S.-backed government there. Few who were watching can forget the images of desperate Afghans surging toward the gates and climbing the walls of Kabul International Airport, then still under control of the U.S. and its coalition partners. War of Afghans running after U.S. Air Force planes as they took off. More than 2,400 American and some 1,200 coalition service members died in Afghanistan, and tens of thousands more suffered physical and emotional wounds. Afghan casualties were astronomically higher. Up to 69,000 Afghan security forces and some 46,000 civilians are thought to have died. Despite 20 years of effort, the U.S. campaign in Afghanistan must be judged a failure. To discuss the causes of this failure and the lessons we can learn from it, I'm joined today by Dr. Carter Malkasian. There's no one better qualified to discuss and answer the hard questions the Afghan campaign raises. Professor Carter Malkasian is the chair of the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School. He was the senior civilian advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, from 2015 to 2019. He has extensive experience in conflict zones, especially Afghanistan and Iraq, and has published several books. He was the State Department political officer for 2 years in Garmsur District in southern Helmand Province, Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011, working alongside 5 consecutive infantry battalions, Afghan tribal leaders, and Afghan local leaders in villages on the Helmand River. Before that, he was a civilian advisor to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force in Al-Anbar Province, Iraq for 1 year in 2004-2005 and 6 months in 2006. He was present for both battles of Fallujah and the Battle for Ramadi. He also worked in Kunar Province, Afghanistan in 2007 and was General Dunford's senior advisor in Afghanistan from March 2013 to August 2014. His newest book is the award-winning The American War in Afghanistan, A History. The New York Times rated it as one of the top 100 books of 2021. Carter received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his doctorate in history from Oxford University. Carter, thank you for joining me today on Chain Reaction. I want to jump straight in and to ask you about the causes of the failure of the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. I know this is a broad topic, but I guess two-part question here. Was it a strategic failure, our 20-year effort in Afghanistan? And if so, why?
Hey, Robert, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the time, and it's an honor to be on Chain Reaction. Why did we fail in Afghanistan? So I don't think there's a single reason. I do think that the main reasons for why we failed, they're hard to change. Success was always going to be difficult, especially if you view success as either completely defeating the Taliban or allowing the Afghan government to stand up on their own and maybe keep on fighting after we leave. those were both going to be very hard to achieve. So why were those going to be hard to achieve? If we start thinking about what are the reasons that we had great difficulties in Afghanistan, what are the reasons the Taliban were able to fight hard, what are the reasons the government didn't fight as hard as they should have? You can start out with governance problems that the Afghan government exhibited. Some of that is corruption. Some of it is how it treated some of its own population, some groups that were marginalized by the government, and then actually marginalized and then mistreated on top of that. So that can include things like groups that probably should have had a say in either the national government or in local government being excluded and not having a say in things. It includes groups like that having some of their livelihood reduced or constrained, such as by having poppy eradicated, whereas the government, for its friends, wouldn't eradicate that poppy, or there's trends of that happening. It includes sometimes the police or the army taxing people, sometimes treating them unfairly, sometimes putting them in jail unfairly. It includes the government not always distributing goods and services, not only not to marginalized groups, but to a large number of groups. And that kind of activity all helped allow a certain amount of support for the Taliban to stay around, especially in the early years when the war was quieter. After that, of course, after the early years, we see the government having a lot of trouble in managing things, a lot of trouble in organizing itself, and again, reaching out to groups it should have reached out to earlier. Now, that's just one problem, though. That's just one issue. And the fact that we have several issues makes it even harder to see how we could have had success in Afghanistan. So we could turn to another issue, Pakistan. Many people have varying opinions on Pakistan, that they were supporting the Taliban outright, they were maybe supporting Al-Qaeda outright. I don't really think that's true. But regardless of what the Pakistan government was doing, there was a large amount of ground on their border that could be used as a safe haven that we couldn't readily get into. So regardless of if the Pakistan government had tried very hard to go after the Taliban or didn't try at all, the Taliban probably were going to have some ability to operate in Pakistan. Just the length of that border, just the difficulty it is for any country in this part of the world to control its territory means that there was a good chance you're going to have the Taliban being able to hide from a lot of our strikes and then come back on into Afghanistan. And you could say also, well, why don't we just up our strikes, do more activity? Well, maybe, but that's kind of a big counterfactual. And it's also not clear that us trying to do more strikes in more area would have been feasible or sustainable. That's another big issue, but that's not the only issue. You could also say, well, yeah, even though they were able to do a lot of things in Pakistan, why couldn't the police, the army, stop them once they entered Afghanistan itself? And what you see there, and this is kind of different from like the governance problems in and of themselves, what you see there is the tribes, the police forces, the army, all the sides that were aligned with the government, they had a tendency to fight with each other, to not get along well, to be divided. And that lack of cohesion made it easy for the Taliban to peel various groups off to work with them. The roots of that discord go back to different communities, different ways that tribes relate to each other, the fact that tribes don't have a kind of hierarchy that really helps instill cohesion and order. So that, on kind of a structural sense, that made the government side weaker than the Taliban, and the Taliban actually do have a little bit more structure. Going back a millennium and a couple centuries, one of the reasons that Muhammad was able to rally the supporters of Islam against all the tribes of Arabia was that Islam created a discipline, created an order, even created more of a chain of command than existed with the other tribal groups. Now, I don't want to say that the Taliban are like Muhammad and the tribes of Afghanistan are like the Qurayshi, but the analogy kind of helps us understand a little bit about what's happening there. And so those are several reasons, and there's another reason I would state as well that I think is the most important, which is that the Taliban had an ability to rally the people and to mobilize people that the government didn't have. The government had many supporters, and more supporters than the Taliban had, but the Taliban were able to rally people who were more committed. And they were able to rally the people that were more committed because they could talk about, we're fighting an occupier. they could talk about we represent Islam, and that wasn't just propaganda. I mean, the Taliban are led by real mullahs, real village religious leaders, the people who are closest, the leaders who are closest to the people in the villages. So they could make that call. They could show that they had the justification to make that call. Whereas the government, they could say similar things, but who's fighting on their side? Who's supporting them? Who's enabling them? We are, and we're not Muslim. We are outsiders. We're occupiers, and that made it inherently difficult for the government to rally people. In addition to the other problems they were doing, but even in places where the government was operating fairly well, it would still face this problem. So these all create a set of causes that we can only find a few places where you could we could reasonably think that history would take a different course.
What I think I heard you say, and I'll try to articulate it or restate it really quickly and then ask a follow-up, is the fundamental causes were marginalization of certain groups in Afghanistan by the U.S.-backed government, corruption, the pervasive corruption throughout Afghanistan, which of course is not new to this Afghan government or the U.S.-backed Afghan government, the sanctuary in Pakistan that the Taliban, the Haqqanis, and other groups had, the infighting inside the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan, which allowed the Taliban to peel off certain elements, and then finally, the fact that the Taliban had an identity or an ideology that motivated people on either national or religious grounds, or the idea of resisting an occupier. It occurs to me that none of those things really have anything to do with the U.S. strategy, right? Those are all things that are sort of internal to Afghanistan. And so the question is, I guess, should we have even tried to rebuild a state or a set of institutions in a place that the idea even of the nation didn't really exist yet? Or should we have pursued a much more limited set of objectives centered around destroying al-Qaeda, capturing bin Laden, and maybe reducing the ability of the Taliban to export terrorism? Should it have been more of a punitive expedition than a state-building effort, I guess, is my question.
One thing I'd say, it becomes more of a question of how we manage the strategy, rather than was there a strategy to enable us to succeed entirely. And so there would have been better ways to manage it. What we want to be careful of while we do that, though, is to think that there was a strategy out there that would have enabled us to, given what our goals are, would have likely enabled us to get out earlier. There's only a few things that might have enabled that. And there's even fewer things that maybe would have enabled kind of a government to stand up on its own. It's tempting to look back and to say we just should have, in 2001, solely focus on counterterrorism. And that be the only thing that we do. And I think there's two big things that get in the way of that. The first thing that gets in the way of that is we have to understand ourselves. We have to understand the United States. We have to understand the American people. We have to understand the American political system. And in that American political system, we're going to care about democracy somewhere. It's going to be very hard for a government to go in and say we're not creating a democracy. That's probably not even tenable. That's probably death to the endeavor, whether the endeavor is worth it or not. So and we might logically say, hey, that just doesn't fit in Afghanistan. It doesn't fit in Iraq. And I think there may be a lot to that. But we also have to understand if we do, when we did it, and if we were to do it again, we're going to care a lot about making sure that there's a democracy there. You have to think of some very extreme cases where we wouldn't care about it being a democracy in the place, where we'd be willing to think, okay, we'll deal with whatever totalitarian or authoritarian, non-democratic government is here because it's important for us. And people might point to, well, Saudi Arabia is kind of like that. And I'd argue that, well, there's a difference between we have diplomatic relations and even something that nears an alliance with a country versus we're going to go fight and die there. And I would argue that I don't mean to talk so much about Saudi Arabia, unless Iran was outright attacking and invading Saudi Arabia, it would be difficult for us to be there in supporting combat operations, just look like what happened in Yemen and everything like that. So the point being that we have to understand that there's a great chance that what we're going to want to do is instill democracy someplace. And I said I had 2 points. So the second point is you have to understand the environment of the time, the fear of terrorism, the fear of another attack happening in the United States, that for at least the first 10 years of the war made it very difficult to get out and helped create this pressure that we have to do things to get it right. So we didn't pay attention to Afghanistan in the 90s. Now we should pay attention to Afghanistan unless things go wrong. And paying attention to it could include building up institutions and doing enough that things won't, that'll have the proper kind of government. So, you put those things two together, the feeling that we have to be involved in democracy and do things for it, and then the fact that there's a political cost to ignoring terrorism, and you get a situation in which we're likely to be there, and it's hard to institute something that is like purely doing CT strikes.
So that makes perfect sense. It's a great explanation for why we didn't pursue the very limited counterterrorism, almost punitive expedition option up front. Let me ask another counterfactual then. Why did we not stay until democracy had been instituted in Afghanistan? It was clear when we withdrew that for all the reasons that you articulated in your answer to the first question, marginalization, corruption, infighting, the fact that there was no national identity or ideology that the government of Afghanistan could set against that of the Taliban that could hold its own. So clearly democracy had not taken hold and we left. So why did we do that?
So democracy was not our main goal in Afghanistan. Our main goal was stopping terrorism. The main reason that we stayed in if there hadn't been a terrorist threat, it wouldn't have been in Afghanistan in the first place. And so that's the threat that holds us there. Why do we eventually become less worried about that threat? We become less worried about that threat, because the threat had diminished. And really at this point, Al-Qaeda had been severely hit. Bin Laden was dead. Islamic State had been defeated in Iraq and Syria. It had been suppressed and limited, and every one of its leaders was getting killed in Afghanistan. On top of that, the United States has new strategic concerns: China, Russia, COVID. We can even throw climate change in there. So the wars against the terrorist threat is far less threatening, and there's other greater threats for the United States. So now the value of staying in the war had decreased. In addition to that, there had been a series of decisions made, under the Trump administration that made staying even harder. Not impossible to stay, but it made it that the possibility of getting anything out of the conflict, the possibility of reaching a negotiated settlement, had dwindled dramatically. But that's not as important as the first things I mentioned. But when you think of the decision that Biden had to make, he wasn't facing the same decision that like Obama could make at the end of his term. He was facing a military situation that was far worse, and it looked like you might even have to reinvest at times to keep things okay. So the decision he had to make was a much more difficult decision than what Obama had to make.
I love this answer, Carter, because it really brings into clear and sharp focus how hard this is, right? And the fact that they're making these decisions in the context of the United States as a global power and has global interests and global threats and global opportunities. And so I like to answer that. So the immediate casus belli, the counterterrorism mission, had largely been accomplished, right, by the time we withdrew in 2021, 2 years ago this month. Important, but not quite as important, initial cause, building a democracy, building a functioning state, had clearly not been accomplished, but it looked like it was going to take a lot more effort, a lot more time, and maybe an increase, right, of our commitment to Afghanistan in the context of a world where all these other challenges and threats were percolating up and were getting the attention of the national security community in the U.S. So that, and again, in retrospect, the decision in the series of decisions that led us to what I consider a strategic failure in Afghanistan makes sense in the context of the time in which they were made, right? So let me ask you another question. You've got a lot of time on the ground in Afghanistan, a lot of experience in the region. When did it become clear to you and why that we were not having success, that we were not likely to succeed in achieving our stated objectives?
In a certain way, it depends on how you see what our objectives were and what we were going to do. I mean, I always thought that if you were going to do something in Afghanistan, any of the gains that you were going to make, you'd have to have some number of troops stay on the ground, basically indefinitely. Now, I didn't think it would take a large number, but I kind of always thought that. What started to change in my mind over time was, is it worth the costs that we're putting in? Is it worth it? And so the first times it became, I had more. It's always a question I'm thinking about. From 2009 onwards, it's a question to think about. But then what I really started noticing in 2013 and 2014. So 2013 and 2014, we're starting to withdraw U.S. presence. We're well into withdrawing U.S. presence from a lot of places where we had been fighting. Now, some of these places were really far out, like Musa Qala or the borders of Andar and Ghazni. So places that we wouldn't call vital to a province, let alone vital to the Afghan country overall. But we're now withdrawing from places where you're leaving small posts of posts of Afghans and police out there now on their own to fight. And so, as an academic, I'm thinking, okay, these are our first test cases. These places here are going to tell us how this thing could fall out, because now we're going to get to see them fight on their own. And this is, like about 2 years before the more heavier fighting that was going to emerge. So, but even at first during that time, there were some places that fought well on their own and could manage things, and that was very heartening to see. Some places like in southern Helmand where 500 Taliban would attack, the police would learn about the attack beforehand, they'd go and preempt it, or they'd put themselves in a place to defend against the attack, do a counterattack, often didn't need U.S. air, or sometimes didn't need U.S. air. I want to be careful about using the term often. So you had some occasions like that were just heart-lifting to see. But then there were other cases where the police and army outnumbered the Taliban, but lost like most of a district or an entire district. And this is like in Sangin, in Musa Qala, and then like some parts of Nangarhar had the same issue happening. So you see that, and you start to become a little more worried that if we had a problem here, maybe we're going to have a problem elsewhere. And that really, that's when I started worrying a little bit more about what we needed to do, and what was possible. And at kind of the tactical operational level, it made it clear that some things needed to happen, like places that are vital, you're going to need to make sure you can still conduct airstrikes around. You still need to make sure you can reinforce and give support. That's more of a tactical operational question. Then 2015 happens. And in 2015, the Taliban take Kunduz. Again, the Afghan forces outnumbered the Taliban. They also, in Helmand, take Marja and most of the areas surrounding Lashkar Gah. They attack Lashkar Gah, the provincial capital itself. They attack the capital of Ghazni, having overrun all the gains that had been made in Ghazni over the previous 5-6 years. So now you have not just examples that were out in the hinterlands. Now you have examples of significance that are happening to show that there's a problem that exists. And what all of that, by 2015, that confirmed to me that in terms of strategy, that if we didn't want to lose the country, some number of Americans had to stay. But it also confirmed for me that there isn't much point in putting a large number of Americans in, because we already had our surge, we already tried to gain things, and it all went backwards. So you just want to keep in the minimum. You want to keep in the smallest number possible to prevent things from falling apart. And that's what a variety of generals had kind of come to the same conclusion. So General Dunford, General Miller, they thought the same way. General Votel, that you just keep this at the minimum level possible to hold things together to prevent terrorist threats to the United States. And if we don't want the government to fall, because that's going to increase the chance of a terrorist threat, so just hold things together, and we don't need to go asking for a lot of troops. We were going to be careful, and we'll do careful calculations for if you draw down this much, what does that do to your capability to provide support? But then over that same period of time, or actually by 2016, 2017, I was starting to think also that we needed to be very upfront in our policy making to make sure there were options to get out. That we need not only to say that don't put in more forces, keep it at the minimum, just kind of maintain things, but we should be saying we should be putting getting out as an option. Now, it's not long. I mean, the policymakers kind of want that anyway, so it effectively becomes an option. But it's, over time, and kind of come to the conclusion that we can't be sure this is worth it. And if you're saying you have to be there a long time with a certain number of troops, and there isn't any way out of it, then you also have to consider just getting out. You have to consider if the terrorist threat is worth staying in like that.
Yeah, I think back as you were talking, my last deployment there was in 2017, and first time I was there was in 05, 06. And in 05 and 06, we would drive from Kabul to Bagram and back routinely. In 2017, nobody drove anywhere. Even Kabul to Bagram, which was a 20, 30-minute flight, we would fly because you couldn't drive, right? It was too unsafe. So, but nevertheless, even then, having seen this security situation deteriorate over the years, the economic situation seemed to be a little bit on the uptick. You would see signs of economic life that I never saw in 2005 or 2006. So it wasn't clear to me, even in 2017, that this was unrecoverable. So I do want to be sort of have a little bit of empathy and understanding for the people above you and me, who are having to make those decisions about whether this was unrecoverable or not. I remember having a discussion in U.S. Embassy in Kabul about it was costing a total about 25 to 30 billion a year total, Afghanistan and Pakistan together, in U.S. aid and what it was costing to keep the war going, aid to Pakistan, and then the cost of aid to Afghanistan and all of supporting our operations there. And it was costing somewhere, below 10 casualties a year in terms of U.S. deaths, huge casualties on the part of the Afghan National Army. But the question was, can we do this indefinitely, right? And can we? 25 billion a year sounds like a lot, but in the context of even the U.S. defense budget of 800 billion, it's not that much. Below 10 casualties is, every death is terrible, but we lose about that many people at training centers every year, right? So the question was, can we just keep doing this indefinitely? And if we do, will we ever get to the place where Afghanistan is stable and democratic enough and can stand on its own? Do you think that option was available? Did you keep plodding along until
in terms of the economic costs and the costs that you laid out, it was sustainable to be able to do that year after year. It was a manageable cost. I mean, the 27 billion that was being spent about per year from 2015 onward, that's about the amount we're spending in Ukraine right now. So it's not like the expenses have gone down.
Right.
That was sustainable. Would it have enabled the Afghan government to stand on its own someday? I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but I don't. As arguing that in policy, that if you do this, you will get a government that can stand on its own. There wasn't enough evidence to say that, and that's why General Dunford often uses the term. This is term life insurance. It's good as long as you pay.
Yeah.
Once you stop paying, that's it. So we're holding down the terrorist threat. We're keeping the government up, and we can do that at a sustainable cost. If we leave, we have no guarantees that that's going to be able to maintain itself, and we saw some of that in 2021. Now, the other thing about the debate about staying or leaving, the leaving debate, the leaving side of the argument, there wasn't a strong consensus about what would happen to the Afghan government, how long they would survive. I tended to think they wouldn't survive, or they'd survive in a very kind of rump sense. But it was always hard to be able to lay out an exact timeline for what that would be. Between immediate, like we saw, or they could last for 3 years or so. Just look at the logistics lines of the amount of time it would take to mass if they actually defended Kabul, that kind of stuff. You get variable timelines for how long they would last. Now, some people though did think that they would last a long time, or perhaps last like forever, because the Taliban, they'd have less support, they'd have problems with cohesion. And the thing that people often said was, once we're not there, the Afghans will know that they need to stand up and they'll actually have to do more. That was a little bit, I've heard that argument stated. I heard that argument used to be stated in Iraq, stated in Afghanistan, and I find it woefully idealistic because you're thinking that if you're not there, that they have one choice to stand up and fight. No, they have two or three choices. One of them is to run out of the country. The other one is to make a deal with the other side and surrender rather than die. And once you're gone, you're changing their whole calculation for the odds of military success. So when you change that calculation, and that you're gonna if they thought military success was more likely than defeat, now all of a sudden defeat's going to become more likely. So better not to lose your life. And so people tend to forget that. So there were different thoughts about how long the Afghan government could survive, which in some ways made leaving an easier argument to make then. I think even like for President Biden, if he had known what was going to, he had an idea what was going to happen in August of 2021. But if he had known it with certainty that was going to happen, or more people within the military, more people in the IC, more people within the NSC, if they had known that was going to happen, I think the argument for staying would not have been as strong.
And that all makes perfect sense. They'll stand up on their own if we leave argument reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld's "take your hand off the Iraqi bicycle seat" metaphor. Remember that he used, assuming that if you take your hand off the bicycle seat, they'll start to steer and pedal on their own. Like you said, they always have the option to jump off the bike or give the bike to the enemy or crash the bike.
I took my hand off my daughter's bicycle seat 2 or 3 times, and there were some disasters that happened.
Exactly. So it's a metaphor, and no metaphor is perfect, but I think it speaks to the fact that, hey, these partner governments have other options if we withdraw our support either suddenly or with a lot of warning. It's not determined that they're gonna stand up on their own. Let me ask you a final question, Carter, and that is, have we, the U.S. government or the Department of Defense, undertaken a postmortem of the war in Afghanistan? In other words, has there been a concerted effort to understand the reasons for the failure, leveraging the experiences of people like you to learn lessons and make sure that, if possible, we prevent a similar outcome?
Well, SIGAR did the report about the collapse, and there's the War Commission that's going on. So you can't say that there isn't some degree of an effort. But overall, the great feeling that I have, and I suspect John Noggle had the same feeling, is we're trying to turn entirely and forget it. In a lot of ways, it feels like this is an enforced exercise in forgetting. And so, there's definitely threats from Ukraine, threats from Russia, a war in Ukraine, threats from China that need to be attended to. And I'm very cognizant of when you need to get an organization or several organizations to turn and face something else, you often can't give them options. You often have to make sure everyone goes in this direction, because if you give options to do something else, too many people will go the other way. So sometimes you just have to force things, and I understand that. But the degree to which today, that if you mention Afghanistan, if you talk about Iraq, if you mention dealing with terrorism, it's almost like you've drawn a red letter on yourself. You're someone who doesn't get it, that you're still stuck in the last wars. And that's probably not healthy. It doesn't do us good to forget 20 years of combat experience and sacrifice. And we're likely, by not looking at it, it's cliche to say repeat the same mistakes. But when we have to face similar situations, that might not be a full-blown intervention. It just could be the wide variety of things one has to do against an adversary that's not a peer, that doesn't have nuclear weapons. So when we have to do that again, we will have forgotten some things that occurred. We won't do some things as well. We may remember the wrong things. We may remember the things that worked, the CTI operations that worked, the patrolling that worked, the partnering that worked, the relationships were formed. And we may take those things that are in the immediate forefront of our mind and think that they're solutions, when they're not solutions. They're pragmatic and wise tactical actions. We may forget the cost of being in places like this. We may forget how interests change, how something that when it happens appears really, really important, but then 10 years, 20 years later, it's not an interest anymore. And therefore, the sacrifice you put in early, maybe you should have thought about if it was going to be worth it over the long term. Those kind of questions can easily be not remembered, which won't be healthy for us.
So, Carter, you mentioned Ukraine, and it occurred to me as you were talking, every U.S. government and DoD institution that I know is right now doing a Ukraine study. There are more than I can count. And when you compare that to the paucity of really in-depth, long-term studies of Afghanistan, it's sort of striking. While it's much more comforting to examine your success, and because Ukraine at this point is seen as largely as a success, so it may be more emotionally comforting and intellectually comforting to examine your successes than to examine your failures. But I would argue that we learn more from failure than we do from success. So I'm one of those people that hopes there will be at some point a long-term, in-depth study of the 20-year experience in Afghanistan that leads to some findings, conclusions, and recommendations that we can take forward into the next time when we do this. We will fight a decades-long counterinsurgency again, right? It's almost impossible to imagine.
I don't mean to say that there is work going into it. The Army Center for Military History, they're doing work on Afghanistan. There's other military historians doing work on Afghanistan. So it's happening. Parts of it are happening. I'm not sure if it's getting the attention it deserves. And I'm not only the attention it deserves, are the results themselves going to be paid attention to? Or are they going to be forgotten? So those are some of the issues at hand.
I guess the question is whether there's a demand signal for this type of Afghan study coming from the top leadership of the U.S. government and the Department of Defense. I would argue there should be. It's great. I think it's great that military historians and people are doing what they do, right? Which is do the postmortem of this, figure out what happened and why. But if there's no demand signal from the top, that means there will be no senior leader eyes on those reports when they come out, and maybe no lessons learned and institutionalized. So, Carter, this has been a fascinating, sobering discussion for me. Thank you so much for sharing your decades of experience in and on Afghanistan with us. And thank you for joining me today on Chain
Thank you, Robert.
All right. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.